had been released from Egypt. The first they had been enslaved in Egypt, subjected to hard labor in Egypt. And then Moses and his brother Aaron were sent by God to get them out of Egypt, to bring them forth out of Egypt. So they went to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and asked him to let the people go into the wilderness to worship the God of the Hebrews in the wilderness, together with their wives, their children, their livestock, everything they had. And Pharaoh had been refusing. So 10 plagues have been visited upon Egypt, 10 plagues, one after the other. These plagues have been visited upon the Egyptians and not upon the Hebrews. The Hebrews have been neighbouring the Egyptians or living in areas just beside them, but they had not been afflicted by the plagues in the same way as the Egyptians were. The Egyptians were afflicted with these plagues and the Hebrews were not. And the last 10th plague, the 10th plague, was the killing of the firstborn. The firstborn children of the Egyptians were killed by the angel who skipped Pesach. He passed over the houses of the Hebrews. After that, Pharaoh and all the Egyptians, they were very anxious that the Israelites leave, get out as soon as possible, not to tarry at all. And they gave them gifts and livestock, and they entreated them to hurry up and leave. And so they left. And we are told that when they left, God did not lead them by way of the Philistines, that is a straight path from Egypt into the Holy Land, but he took them on a roundabout way for different reasons. One of the reasons was because he thought that when they should face opposition immediately from the Philistines, having been subjected for so long by the Egyptians, they were not inured sufficiently in order to face up to the rigours of warfare. This is the explanation of Ibn Ezra, and it would take time for them to adjust themselves. So therefore they were taken by a roundabout way. Another reason that the Bible itself countenances is that it was so that the Egyptians should be enticed, as if to say, to chase after the Hebrews, and this would bring about their destruction. And this is what the Bible tells us. The Pharaoh, when he saw the Hebrews who had come to the shores of the Red Sea, and there was nowhere for them to go, he said they must be confused, they must have addled their senses in their confusion, in their hurry to leave, and their emotional state. They must have confused themselves, and they must have allowed themselves to be trapped in the wilderness, and now they're up against the sea, and there's nowhere there for them to run. And at this time, at this very minute when he came to this conclusion, he had been told this by spies he had sent with the Israelites. That is what the Aramaic translations tell us. And he decided that the Israelites were in confusion and they were vulnerable, and at this very moment both he and his servants were regretting having sent the Israelites away. They regretted losing this workforce, and so they decided to chase after the Israelites and overcome them. So Pharaoh got together the rest of his army, all of his chariots and his horsemen, and his best soldiers, and he had special chariots each one with a team of 3 men, super chariots we may say, 600 of these, together with all the other chariots and all the other horsemen. They pursued after the Israelites, and they were about to overcome them whilst the Israelites were camping besides the Red Sea. Now, when the Israelites had left, God had sent a pillar of cloud, a pillar of cloud to guide them by day, and a pillar of fire by night. And they were camping by by the sea, beside the sea. And when they saw Pharaoh, and that is, they saw the forces of the Egyptians coming, approaching them, they were afraid. Of course they were afraid. Who wouldn't be? Or through Moses, God told them not to worry, to be quiet, and to rest assured that the Almighty would save them. And after that, God took the pillar of cloud, which was then before them, and he took it and put it behind them, that it should intervene between themselves and the Egyptians, so that the Egyptians couldn't see and wouldn't be able to do anything to them, whereas they themselves had the pillar of fire, which gave them light in their encampment. Moses was commanded to stretch his rod over the sea, and he did so, and a strong east wind blew all night long, a strong east wind. A wind from the east blew all night long. And we know, or people, scientists and researchers know that in that area, on the Red Sea, there are sometimes strong winds, and the strong winds do sometimes affect the level of the sea. This is a known phenomenon. And according to Nachmanides, this known phenomenon was deliberate. That was why the east wind blew, so that Pharaoh and the Egyptians should think that it was a natural phenomenon and follow the Israelites through the dry bed of the sea, and then the waters could come back over and drown them, as indeed happened. Now this might be something to it, there might be something to this. It's worth considering, it's worth keeping in mind also the attitude of Maimonides. You have Nachmanides and you have Maimonides, two different people. So Maimonides, he didn't believe much in miracles, or the concept was something that was strange to him, did not resolve itself with his philosophical outlook. And he took the attitude that there was something in nature. There was something in the nature of the universe, of the world, of water itself, that the Almighty, when he created the world, he had instilled this attribute within it, so that it would come about that somehow the forces of nature would bring about a cleaving of the waters in the Red Sea. By natural forces, it would be a natural phenomena, even though it would probably only occur once, if at all. It would only occur once in history. The miracle was in the fact that it would come to pass, that it would take place, and the very minute when the Israelites needed it to do so. That was the miracle according to Maimonides. So we have this. This is what happened. The Egyptians pursued the Israelites. The east wind blew all night long. It caused the waters, or not necessarily caused the waters, consequently, the waters of the sea divided. The waters of the sea divided. There were two walls of water, one on the right-hand side, one on the left-hand side. And the Israelites passed through the dry path between these two walls of water. They went in. And the Egyptians came after them. The Egyptians saw what had happened, and they came racing, charging after them. And whilst the Egyptians were in the middle, suddenly God caused the wheels of the chariots of the Egyptians to fall off. So the horses were dragging chariots without wheels, and the Egyptians suddenly became afraid. They knew that it was the hand of God against them. And they tried to turn back. They were in a terrible fear, panic, one could say. Moses was commanded to stretch his hand once again over the sea, and he did so, and the waters came back and covered the Egyptians. They drowned the Egyptians, and the Israelites found the bodies of the Egyptians washed up on the seashore. After that, Moses went out, and he sang a song with the people. And following that, Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, she also led the women out. She had a timbrel, a kind of tambourine, a musical instrument. She went out with the women, and they sang and they danced. Miriam was the sister of Moses and Aaron. She was also a prophetess in her own right. They continued. They came to a place called Mara. At Mara, the waters were bitter. The word Mara in Hebrew means bitter. It could be cognate. It could be related to the English word ma, meaning impair, harm, damage, M-A-R. Impaired, M-A-R, could be related to the Hebrew word ma, meaning bitter. At all events, Moses commanded that a tree be cut down and thrown into the water, and it was, and this made the water sweet and able to be drunken and drinkable. At this place, God promised the Israelites that if they obey him and keep the commandments, they will be saved from all the sicknesses with which the Egyptians had been afflicted. Exodus 15:6, for I am the Lord who heals you. And so the Israelites came to Elim. They came to a place called Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees. The 12 wells of water possibly represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and the 70 palm trees represent the 70 members of the Sanhedrin, which was to become the supreme council of the Israelite nation. It was to be instituted by Moses, and it was to have 17 members. After being in Elim, they continued and came to the wilderness of Sin. In the wilderness of Sin, they were hungry, they wanted food, so an enormous flock of quails came down on the camp and covered the ground, and so they had meat. This bird, this quail-type creature, this fowl, it's a kosher type of bird. It is known, it does happen in that area that birds come in from elsewhere on their migratory path, collapse as if they come in and they're exhausted, and they just literally collapse on the ground and cover the ground until they recover their breath and they fly on. There are an enormous number of birds in these flocks, and apparently at this time this is something similar happened, but there were even more birds than was usual. So we have the quail coming in, the birds coming in and lying on the ground for the Israelites to pick them up and eat them. In the morning they found manna on the ground. Manna on the ground was a type of edible substance described in the Bible. It's a type of edible substance that fell outside of the camp, and it could be just scooped up and eaten. And it was nutritious, and this was the main food of the Israelites for 40 years. 40 years in the wilderness, they would eat this manna. And the manna would appear in the morning, and it had to be scooped up and taken, because if it was left, it would rot. And this manna was available to the Israelites all the time they were in the wilderness. It would appear every morning for 6 days a week. For 6 days a week, the manna would be there. On Shabbat, it would not be there. On the 6th day, the day before Shabbat, the Israelites were told to go out and take a double portion. There would be extra manna there, because on Shabbat there would not be any. So this is what they had, and this is what they did. From the wilderness of Sin, they came to Rephidim. They went on to Rephidim, and there the people thirsted for water. They were rebellious. Remember that they had old people with them, they had children with them, and no one can go without food and water for very long without feeling very disgruntled. Also, we don't know how serious the situation was. We should not blame the people for constantly complaining, because it is very difficult not to complain when you're hungry and thirsty, and sometimes you're in extreme circumstances. So they were thirsty. And they were commanded, Moses was commanded to take his staff and to strike a rock at a place called Horeb, which was apparently nearby, and water would come out of the rock, and he did so. So there's an interesting point mentioned by Rabbi David Hoffman, who's a scholar, a Jewish scholar in Germany, and he wrote in German. His book has been translated into Hebrew, and it has some interesting observations. So he points out that As Moses was told in Exodus 17:5-6 to take your rod with which you struck the Nile and to smite the rock. Okay, and he did so. But you have the expression, take your rod with which you struck the Nile. And when he struck the Nile, that was the first plague which they brought upon the Egyptians. The first plague was when they struck the Nile with the rod, and the Nile water and all the other waters of Egypt turned to blood. That was the first plague. But who struck the rod? Aaron. It says in Exodus 7:9 that not Moses, but Aaron struck the rod. It says, then the Lord spoke to Moses, say to Aaron, take your rod and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, over their canals, over their ponds, and over all other pools of water, so that they may become blood. And there will be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and vessels of stone. Moses and Aaron did so just as the Lord commanded, and lifted up the rod. That is, Aaron lifted up the rod and struck the waters that were in the river. And the side of Pharaoh and the side of his servants and all the waters that were in the river turned to blood. Aaron struck the river with the rod. Here it says that Moses struck the rod. It says that Moses struck the water with the rod. So Rabbi Hoffman explains that since Aaron was doing what Moses told him at the command of God, it was as if Moses himself did it. So this is a principle worth noting, because we find elsewhere when the prophets speak to angels that sometimes the angels are described as saying themselves, giving the message, and suddenly they switch to as if to say that God himself is giving the message. So we have a switching between the personalities. And also, in this case, we have a switching between the personalities where Moses gave the commandment and Aaron carried it out. And this is a principle that emissary of a person is as a person himself. So this is what happened. After that, the Amalekites attacked. The Amalekites were descended from Esau. Esau was a twin brother of Jacob. He was an arch enemy of Israel. And Amalekites said, of all the descendants of Esau, the Amalekites are the worst, are the most virulent, the most antagonistic towards Israel, and also in this case they came from far away to attack the Israelites, as we learned from elsewhere. And they fought against the Israelites, and Moses told his deputy Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim to choose men and go out and fight against them, and they did. And in the next day, Moses went up on a hill together with Aaron and Hur from the tribe of Judah. And Moses would raise his hands, and all the time that he raised his hands, the Israelites would conquer. When he let his hands drop, the Israelites would lose. And since he was more than 80 years old, it's a bit difficult for him. So Moses and Hur, they took a rock, put a rock behind him, he sat on the rock, and then each one of them held his hands up, and they defeated the Amalekites. And this is a prototype for the future, where Judah is represented by Moses, because above Moses from the tribe of Levi and Judah had a similar task of learning the law, teaching the law, and the Levites were destined to attach themselves to Judah. And Ephraim, that is Joseph, is represented by Joshua, the deputy of Moses, because Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim, and Ephraim was one together with Manasseh, with the two tribes of Joseph. And they also represent the future Messiah, son of David, who will lead Judah in the end times, and the Messiah, son of Joseph, who will lead the 10 tribes, and they will work together. And in the end times, the Messiah, son of Joseph, shall defeat Esau, as we are told in Abijah 1. The house of Jacob shall be a fire, the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble. They shall burn them and consume them. And there shall be no survivors from the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. So in this case too, Joseph, through Joshua, defeats Esau, that is Amalek, and this was a prototypical of what will happen in the end times. May the Lord God of Israel bless you. Thank you. Shalom. This is Yair Davidiy speaking to you from the land of Israel. We are continuing our study of the book of Exodus. We are doing this through the weekly portion which is read out in the synagogue every Shabbat, so that at the end of a year, the whole of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, the Pentateuch, will be completed. This present portion is called Be-Shelach, the sending forth, when Pharaoh sent forth the Israelites out of Egypt. Remember that the Egyptians had been subjecting the Israelites to hard labor. They wanted to destroy them or diminish their numbers. And this is what they were doing, this through oppression. And Moses had been sent together with his brother Aaron to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. So they went to Pharaoh and they told him, warned him to let them leave with their children, with their wives, with their livestock, with everything they had. And Pharaoh had been refusing. So 10 plagues had come upon him, 10 different plagues, one plague after the other, until Pharaoh had no choice but to let them go. The last plague was the killing of the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. Remember that each plague had come upon the Egyptians, it had not come upon the Israelites. So the 10th plague was the killing of the firstborn, after which Pharaoh let the Israelites go. In fact, he hurried them up to leave. He was giving them livestock of his own so that they may have extra with which to offer sacrifices up to their God in the wilderness. And God is referred to in these portions as the God of the Hebrews, because that is what God Almighty is. He's the God of the Hebrews. Portion Be-Shelach encompasses chapter 13, verses 17 to 20, 14, 15, 16, and 17. It speaks of the cleaving of the Red Sea in sunder, when the Red Sea was split in half, with the waters forming two walls on each side, and a dry path where the waters had been for the Israelites, the Hebrews, to pass through up to the other side. The Egyptians came racing, pursuing after them, whilst the Israelites passed over up into dry land on the other shores. The Egyptians continued to try and go through the pathways. The wheels of their chariots fell off. They were stuck in the middle, and then Moses stretched out his hand, and the waters returned to how they had been, and all of the Egyptians were drowned. And this is an important subject, is an important theme in the biblical history, in general history. The concept of the cleaving of the Red Sea and all that it represented of the liberty from oppression and so on was an important matter in the eyes of the early Anglo-Saxon settlers, English-speaking settlers in North America, and of civilized people everywhere. Benjamin Franklin wanted a depiction of the Israelites passing through the Red Sea and of the Egyptians being drowned in the Red Sea to be part, or to be the theme of the Great Seal of the USA. And in the end he was overruled. They chose something else, possibly better, I don't know, but they chose something else. But it is, nevertheless, it is significant that the theme of the passing through the Red Sea was seriously considered, is worth noting.